This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that quietly trained itself to accept distortion as normal, to reward it, to depend on it. For years, the numbers stopped meaning what they said. Values stretched, risks blurred. Institutions nodded along because everyone was still getting paid. And then suddenly, the math stopped cooperating. What you're watching now is not punishment. It's not revenge. It's a delayed reaction, a system discovering too late that it built its power on representations it never bothered to verify. And when verification finally arrives, it doesn't arrive gently. If you think this is about a single asset or a single figure, you're already behind the story. Because the danger here isn't collapse, it's exposure. Stay with me. Because once a system shows you how it really works, it doesn't get to hide again. And what comes next explains why this moment could not stay contained. What actually controls this system is not elections, not outrage, not even ideology. It's leverage. Quiet, contractual, boring, and absolute. Power no longer sits with people. It sits with valuations, with balance sheets that decide who gets oxygen and who doesn't. For a long time, that power drifted away from public accountability and settled into private hands. Banks, lenders, gatekeepers whose job was supposed to be verification, not belief. But belief was easier. Belief was profitable. So the system learned a dangerous habit. If a claim was big enough, confident enough, repeated often enough, it stopped being questioned. It became background noise, assumed true because challenging it would slow the machine. That's the frame you have to hold. This is not about enforcement suddenly becoming aggressive. It's about enforcement waking up inside a system that has already been bent out of shape. And once leverage shifts, everything else follows. Because the next thing that changes is not the law, it's behavior. And that shift was already underway. The most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They arrive slowly. They feel reasonable at first. There was a time when verification came before approval, when claims were challenged, when numbers had to survive skepticism before they became power. That time didn't end overnight. It eroded, standards softened, exceptions multiplied, temporary allowances became permanent shortcuts. Before, value was something you proved. Now, value became something you declared, and the system adjusted around that declaration. Risk models adapted. Compliance learned how to look the other way without technically blinking. Nothing collapsed. That's why no one panicked. Growth continued. Money moved. Success stories piled up, held together by assumptions no one wanted to test. But here's the quiet shift most people missed. Once a system stops checking reality, it doesn't become flexible. It becomes fragile because every unchallenged claim stacks pressure. Every tolerated distortion narrows the margin for error. And eventually, the system reaches a point where even a small correction doesn't correct. It exposes, and the first exposure is never the last. Then the system flinched, not with a warning, with an action. Operational control of a cornerstone asset was removed in real time, not frozen on paper, not delayed by appeal, physically transferred, events canceled, access restricted, oversight installed. This wasn't symbolic. It was mechanical. A judge didn't question intent, didn't debate politics, focused on numbers that could not coexist in the same reality. One valuation for borrowing, another for taxation, separated not by nuance, but by orders of magnitude. That discrepancy wasn't treated as creativity. It was treated as pattern. And once that pattern was documented, the system did something it almost never does to powerful actors. It moved first. If you're watching this thinking, this feels sudden, that's because you're seeing the end point, not the buildup. Months of quiet compilation, years of tolerated behavior, decades of institutional hesitation. This moment looks dramatic only because enforcement waited so long. If you want to understand why that hesitation mattered, stay with me. Because the real story isn't the seizure. It's why it took this long to happen and what else was allowed in the meantime. This is where the system reveals how it actually works. Damage does not land where decisions are made. It travels. Those inflated numbers didn't just unlock loans. They shifted risk outward, away from the people signing the documents and toward institutions designed to absorb fallout quietly. Fees were collected up front. Risk was deferred. Responsibility was diluted across committees, subsidiaries, and plausible deniability. Everyone along the chain could say the same thing. This wasn't my call, and that's the mechanism. Not fraud as a single act, but fraud as a distributed process. The beneficiaries were immediate and visible. Capital access, prestige, leverage multiplied. The damage was delayed and abstract until it wasn't. Because once one institution starts questioning assumptions, others have to follow. Exposure spreads laterally. Audits trigger reviews. Reviews trigger cooperation. And suddenly, what looked like confidence starts to look like coordination. That's when the system stops protecting reputations and starts protecting itself, which explains why the next shock didn't come from enforcement. It came from inside the financial world itself. And when that happened, the narrative changed fast. Cooperation began quietly. Then it spread. Documents appeared. Emails surfaced. Language that had been buried in footnotes moved to the center of the record. Executives didn't deny the numbers. They described them optimistic, aggressive, assumed, not wrong, just convenient. But convenience has a shelf life. Internal warnings had existed. They were acknowledged, then overridden, because the upside was immediate and the downside belonged to someone else. Once that logic was exposed, alliances shifted. Institutions recalculated. Distance became strategy. Silence broke. A voice that rarely speaks publicly did something unusual. It didn't accuse. It didn't argue. It stated a principle that when trust is treated as optional, math eventually intervenes. And math is indifferent to reputation. That statement didn't need amplification. Markets understand that language instinctively. And when they do, confidence doesn't decline gradually. It evaporates. Which is why the next phase wasn't legal. It was human. And it moved faster than the paperwork. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because this system doesn't collapse upward. It collapses outward. Toward you. You don't negotiate valuations. You don't sign off on loans, but you live downstream from their consequences. When institutions misprice reality, the correction doesn't show up as an apology. It shows up as tightening, as caution, as access quietly disappearing. Credit becomes harder to get. Rates stay higher longer. Risk tolerance vanishes for people who never benefited from the distortion in the first place. And you're told this is just the market being careful. That restraint is responsible. That pain is necessary. But notice who is asked to absorb it. Not the ones who normalized exaggeration. Not the ones who collected fees while standards eroded. You're asked to be patient, to adjust, to trust a system that only recently decided accuracy mattered again. If this feels familiar, it should. Because this pattern doesn't announce itself until after the damage is done. Stay with me. Because what happens next explains why this is no longer a domestic problem. It's already moving beyond borders. Systems like this don't fail in isolation. They transmit. Capital doesn't recognize borders. Neither does distrust. When enforcement collides with long-tolerated distortion, international partners start asking the same question at the same time. What else did we accept without verifying? Foreign banks review exposure. Investors reassess risk premiums. Allies quietly update their assumptions about reliability. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about confidence. When a system markets itself as stable while quietly bending rules for powerful participants, the revelation doesn't stay local. It becomes data, and data travels. Suddenly, transactions slow. Due diligence expands. Deals that once closed on reputation alone require proof. That friction feels small at first, but multiplied across markets, it changes behavior. The world doesn't panic. It pauses, and in finance, a pause is never neutral. It favors those with reserves and punishes those dependent on momentum, which is why the most important question now isn't what was exposed, it's what happens next once the system realizes it can't return to pretending. Because the future doesn't offer just one direction. It offers three. From here, the system has options, not outcomes. Options. The first is adjustment. Standards tighten. Verification becomes routine again. Access slows, but trust rebuilds gradually. This path is quieter. It requires patience and institutional humility. The second is erosion. Rules exist, but selectively. Enforcement happens, but unevenly. Confidence decays without a single breaking point. Nothing collapses outright, but nothing fully stabilizes either. Then there's rupture. That's when delayed accountability collides with political pressure and market fear at the same time. When enforcement is framed as aggression, when compliance is treated as betrayal, and when institutions are forced to choose between credibility and survival, rupture doesn't announce itself as chaos. It presents as stalemate, as paralysis, as systems that technically function but no longer command belief. None of these paths are guaranteed. All of them are plausible. And the system hasn't chosen yet because the final decision doesn't come from law or markets alone. It comes from whether reality is allowed to reassert itself fully or only partially. And that question remains unresolved. What makes this moment dangerous isn't exposure, it's memory. Systems have a habit of learning the wrong lesson, of treating accountability as an anomaly instead of a correction, of tightening just enough to survive, then loosening again once attention fades. Nothing you've heard guarantees permanence. Nothing ensures the next distortion won't be larger, quieter, better disguised. Because the real question was never whether a single structure could be seized. It's whether the system that allowed it to stand for so long is willing to change how it measures truth. If verification remains optional, if leverage continues to outrun scrutiny, if confidence is still allowed to substitute for proof, then this moment won't be a turning point. It will be a rehearsal. Watch what institutions do after the headlines move on. Watch who is rewarded. Watch which rules are enforced consistently and which quietly relax again. That's where the answer lives. If you want to understand what comes next, don't stop here. Because the next phase isn't louder. It's subtler and far more consequential. Stay with me.